Now this video is a Fieldcraft video. I thought about it. It's just too important to only be limited to a militia engineer task video. And this is why you should know your enemy's mines. Now, anyone who serves in the military, before you deploy somewhere in the world, you go through and you have a quick enemy equipment identification class. And part of that class is they show you the mines that your enemy uses. So that way, if you come across this stuff, you can identify it for when you call it up to hire, to let hire know, hey, we found anti-tank mine this type. And then you'll probably be told, well, breach it if you're an engineer, clear it if you're an engineer. If you're someone else, like infantry, who find their mines one footstep at a time, they're told, mark it, bypass, continue on. And then later on, you would have engineers or explosive ordnance disposal come in and take care of the mines. So, first off, one of the reasons you know your enemy's mines is intelligence. Being able to identify the mines, depending on the force you're fighting, whether it is an insurgent force or a conventional military, being able to identify that mine might give you an indication as to how well equipped that insurgent force is. What does it have available to them in their supply system? If it's a modern military and they follow doctrine very closely, being able to identify the mine could give you an indication to the location, the orientation, and intent of a minefield. Example, let's throw out a fictional force. Now, this fictional force in their landmine doctrine for defensive operations, for their minefields, at least on the forwardmost minefields of their belts, in front of their defensive positions, the very front edge, they use plastic cased mines, low metallic mines, to draw the enemy into the minefield before they realize it and start losing vehicles or people. So, in this fictional force, in their IOE, irregular outer edge, and alpha row, very front row of their minefields, plastic case mines. If they're backed by the United States, or had been in the past, it could be an American M19. If they use primarily former comm block equipment, stuff left over from the Warsaw Pact, or stuff given to them by the Chinese, you could potentially see a TM62P3. Being able to identify the type of mine would give you an indication that, hey, we found the front edge of the minefield. But what if you're farther into the minefield? Well, in this threat forces doctrine, at that location, they can use the easier to produce, easier to find, easier to employ metallic mines. If they were backed by the United States, the US M15 heavy metallic anti-tank mine. If they're using former comm block equipment, it could be a TM62 Mike, one of the more common anti-tank mines that are out there. So you come across those, you know that, hey, I'm in a field, I'm in the front edge of the obstacle belt, I'm on a reconnaissance mission, I found this type of mine. It was surface laid, or we found it in its emplacement location. The person didn't camouflage it as well. We were able to uncover it and identify one of the mines. So that tells you you're on the guts of that minefield. Now, this force, maybe they want to stop you from continuing past the minefield. So maybe that last row of the minefield, their Charlie row or Delta row, how many rows deep it is for the minefield doctrine. Maybe they want to use tilt rod fused mines. So if it's the United States, you're talking the M21. If you're looking at former comm block supplies, it could be a TM 57 with an MVSH 57 tilt rod fuse. You see the tilt rod sticking up out of the grass, sticking up out of the sand, you know that you've just found the rear edge of that minefield now. And you're able to map it to send that information to higher. Now, if you're in offensive operations and you drove into it because you're assaulting that objective, well, all you're going to know is there's explosions going off. But if you look ahead and you see those tilt rods sticking up out of the sand, sticking up out of the grass ahead of you, that tells you that's the forward edge of that minefield or rear edge of the minefield. You call that up to higher to let them know so that the forces that are behind you can find a bypass. They know how deep that minefield is, or at least that first belt of that defensive works. Now you can also see the same thing with perimeters on an enemy base, depending on how they set their stuff up. Maybe on the outermost edge, they use bounding fragmentation mines. If it's the United States, you're talking M16 series. If they're using former comm block supplies, it could be an OZM3. Tripwires are set up out there to catch those enemy forces before they even get close to the perimeter. And if they get past that, maybe that force uses on the inside of that protective minefield blast type mines, like a PMN or Giada as this one is. If they're using former comm block equipment. If they're using US equipment or US supplied equipment, it could be an M14. Now we get to the rear edge of that minefield, that final string of mines before you're in the trenches, before you're on that fence. Well, you could see in that location stake mines if they're Russian supplied, the POM Z2 series or POM Z series if they were supplied by the United States. The US doesn't really have a bounding fragmentation mine, but what we would use, or countries that we supply would use, would be an M18A1 Claymore mine. If they're comm block supplied, you're talking MON 50s. Or potentially MON 100s if they want to be really serious on keeping someone out of an area. So being able to identify the mine will tell you where potentially you could be. Now, if it's an insurgent, being able to identify that mine could indicate to Intel when you call it up that that group may have a new source for equipment. Or just tells them that, hey, we've now located that missing shipment of anti-personnel mines that were stolen from friendly security forces. They're now located over in the Hobo Woods area, and they're being used by the drunken redneck group, whatever it might be. Now, another thing that you have with knowing your mines, why it's important. What if you're a resistance fighter or you're special operations? Being able to identify your enemy's mines could also potentially allow you to use those mines if you had the proper training. Before a special forces team goes into an area, the engineer sergeant, if he's worth his weight in salt, will go through and study the mines being employed in that area so that when they come across them, they can defuse them so they could get through a minefield, or defuse them, capture them, and reuse them against the enemy force. It's the same thing for the resistance soldier, for that guerrilla, being able to identify and know the procedures for disarming and arming your enemy's mines gives you a supply of munitions for that group to use. Example, the Viet Cong were really, really good at neutralizing our M16 bounding fragmentation mines in Vietnam. They would then take those mines, which are larger than the OZM-3s and OZM-4s being supplied to them by the Soviet Union, or the Type 69 bounding fragmentation mines given to them by the Chinese. They were much larger, cover a larger area, cause a hell of a lot more casualties. So they would sneak to the edges of American minefields around our bases, locate those tripwires, follow those tripwires back to the mines, put in an improvised safety pin in there to safe the mine. Then they would remove the mine from the ground, and then those same sappers would then use those mines against U.S. and Allied troops. So hopefully you're starting to get the idea now why it's important to study the mines used by your enemy. If you're a conventional force, it's so that you can identify the stuff to call it up for hire. If it's special operations or a resistance soldier, so that maybe you can take those enemy's mines and use them against your enemy. There you go. Hopefully I'm getting you thinking on this. To find out more information on different types of mines that are a little bit more common on the market, that are out there on the international arms black market, check out my Historic Ordnance Series videos. I try to cover as many mines as I can get information on online that I can piece together to allow you to be able to identify them, know how big they are so that you can calculate how much damage that mine can do when it goes off. And if you're one of those special operators or you're in that resistance situation, maybe give you that information so that you can disarm that mine to clear it from the area for the civilians and hopefully use it against that police force, that military force that you're fighting against. Now, for all my engineer brothers and the Patriot and militia movements, always remember, essayons.